All right, guys, we're going to talk about the tides today. That's 6.5. I'm here with Miss Butterfield, and we're just going to kind of walk through the basics of the tide information that you need to know. So, what are tides? So, tides are the gravitational pull or the effect that the moon has on the earth that causes our waters to rise. Now, the sun also has some gravitational pull, but not quite as much as the moon. The moon has more of a gravitational pull on our waters because it is closer to the earth than the sun.
We have two different kinds of tides. There is high tide, where the water is its highest level, and then there is low tide, and that's where the water is at its lowest level. There are two high tides each day and two low tides each day. So if you'll watch the image on your screen, you'll see that as the earth rotates on its axis, as it spins and moves through the day, do you see the yellow triangle? Pretend you're standing on that position on the earth, and as the earth spins around, while you're standing there on the beach, you would see the water rise up to high tide and then go back down to low tide every 6 hours. So as it goes low tide, up to high tide, down to low, back to high, and this pattern repeats. And because our earth spins around and rotates once every 24 hours, you get two high tides each day, two low tides. There's 6 hours between each different tide.
So this is what it looks like if we look at the Earth, Moon, and Sun together. What I'd like for you to notice on this page is how when the Moon and the Earth and the Sun are all in a straight line, so the Moon would either be at a new moon or a full moon, look at the waters that's happening on the Earth. Now that's an over-exaggeration of what's happening to our waters. It doesn't really look like this, but it's oversized to just show the difference between the different positions of the moon. So starting off, no matter where the moon is, we're going to have a high tide in that spot and on the other side or the opposite side of the earth. But there's a special sort of tide that happens whenever the earth, moon, and sun are in a straight line, causing that extra gravitational pull. And that's called a spring tide. So that happens at either a new moon or a full moon. Now there's another special kind of tide that happens twice a month, and that's called a neap tide. And the neap tide is when the moon is at the quarter moon, so either a first quarter or a third quarter moon. And what's happening is that the sun and the gravitational pull from the moon are sort of pulling at opposite ends or at a 90-degree angle. So it's pulling on the water in different spots. So if you notice, it sort of evens out the water all around the earth. If you were to sort of pause this video at one of your quarter moons, you would be able to see that.
All right, here is a stationary diagram so you can see spring tide and neap tide. Notice that spring tides happen in the new moon and full moon phases, and neap tides happen at the first and third quarter phases. There are high tides and low tides every single day of the month, every day of the lunar cycle, which is 29 and a half days. But on the day of a new moon and the day of a full moon, you have a spring tide. So that happens twice a month, give or take. And on the day of the third quarter or the day of a first quarter, you have a neap tide.
So here's just another diagram. Notice the yellow around the earth, that's representing the gravitational pull that the sun has on the earth's water. But the purple sort of going around with the moon around the earth, that is the gravitational pull that the moon has on the earth. So you can see that it has much larger, much more of a pull on our waters than the sun does because it is much closer.
All right, this image is graphing out the difference between high tides and low tides. And the difference between a high tide and a low tide is called tidal range. So if you look at the arrow in the middle of the screen, it says range and then spring tide. Remember, spring tides have the highest high tide, that's that dark blue line, and it goes the highest on the screen. And it also goes to the lowest levels on the screen. So that dark blue arrow up and down the middle of the screen, that shows you the difference between high tide and low tide during a spring tide. Now look at the lighter blue line on the screen. You can see that the high tide is lower, low tide is higher, and look at the light blue arrow on the screen. You have a tidal range for a neap tide, which is much smaller than for a spring tide. Spring tides are also bigger than every other tide any time of the month, and neap tides are smaller than any other tides any time of the month.
All right, and that's it for tides. Please come see us if you have any more questions.